What you are about to hear is the account they worked to keep hidden permanently. For generations, sensitive conversations between allied governments have stayed completely out of public reach, stamped classified, stripped of meaningful content through redaction, or quietly eliminated from any accessible record. But on Wednesday, March 4th, 2026, at precisely 11:47 in the morning, the Canadian government dismantled every convention that has governed international diplomacy between allied nations. Prime Minister Mark Carney personally authorized the unrestricted public release of 14 hours of recorded trade negotiations involving senior Canadian officials and members of the Trump administration. The recordings were captured during January and February of this year and contained clear, unfiltered documentation of the exact language used, the direct threats issued, and the deliberate falsehoods delivered by American officials who were acting on instructions from the President of the United States himself. Nothing like this has ever occurred before in the history of the North American partnership. A sitting allied government has converted its own confidential diplomatic archive into a direct instrument of accountability aimed at a sitting American president. And the impact now tearing through the West Wing is severe and accelerating by the hour. The substance of these recordings is catastrophically damaging. Senior American trade officials can be heard on tape openly acknowledging that the tariff justifications were fabricated from the start. A deputy trade representative is captured laughing while walking through how economic figures were constructed in reverse, starting from a conclusion the administration had already settled on before any genuine analysis was performed. A National Security Council staff member states plainly, in language CBC has already published in near exact form, that the president holds no real interest in what the actual trade deficit figure is. What the president cares about, according to that official, is creating the impression of winning rather than achieving any substantive policy objective. Multiple West Wing sources who spoke to journalists within the 2 hours following the release reported that 3 cabinet secretaries have quietly told the White House chief of staff they are no longer able to stand publicly behind the administration's trade position. The Secretary of Commerce has reportedly stopped communicating entirely. The United States Trade Representative abruptly cleared every scheduled media appearance from the calendar. The Treasury Secretary is reported to be composing a resignation letter. The situation inside the administration is not deteriorating gradually. It is caving in all at once. Understanding why these recordings were made requires going back to January 6, 2026, when President Trump imposed a blanket 25% tariff on every import arriving from Canada. The administration justified the action on national security grounds. The Commerce Department produced a 340-page document arguing that Canadian aluminum, lumber, dairy, and energy exports posed a genuine threat to American economic self-sufficiency. The report identified a $98 billion annual trade deficit with Canada, claimed that Canadian government subsidies placed American producers at a disadvantage of 17 to 22%, and warned that relying on Canadian raw materials created strategic vulnerabilities that could not be tolerated. The document appeared rigorous and well supported on its surface. What the American negotiating team either did not know or chose to ignore was that Canadian officials had been systematically recording every session throughout the entire lead-up period. Canadian law, specifically the Investment Canada Act and accompanying diplomatic record-keeping regulations, explicitly permits trade officials to document bilateral negotiations for official archives when those sessions occur on Canadian soil or through Canadian-operated secure communication systems. 7 of the 14 recorded sessions were conducted over encrypted video connections managed from Global Affairs Canada headquarters in Ottawa. The recordings were entirely lawful, and what they captured destroys the stated rationale for the trade conflict entirely. In a session recorded on January 3rd, 3 days before the tariffs were publicly announced, United States Deputy Trade Representative Jonathan Hartwell tells his Canadian counterpart that the $98 billion deficit figure was, in his exact words as later published by CBC, built to land on a psychologically impactful number. He then acknowledged that the properly calculated deficit, with services, trade flows, and re-exports correctly included, sat closer to $41 billion. He laughed while explaining that the president had specifically demanded a number that started with 9. That single act of manipulation inflated the stated deficit by 58%, and provided the false justification for tariffs, now costing the average American household approximately $2,300 in additional annual expenses. The recordings become significantly more serious from there. A January 4th session captures National Security Council Trade Liaison Rebecca Sims explaining to Canadian officials exactly why the administration chose to frame the tariffs under national security authority rather than proceeding through a standard Section 301 trade investigation. Her words, drawn directly from the released transcript, state that the national security classification allowed the administration to bypass the International Trade Commission review entirely. She confirmed that the president was specifically told this legal route would eliminate the 60-day public comment requirement and remove the need for an independent economic assessment. Put plainly, the administration deliberately chose the legal pathway that generates the least oversight, then surrounded a policy built on manufactured data with procedural barriers designed to prevent scrutiny. Should any of this reach a federal courtroom, the legal exposure is severe. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 grants the president substantial authority to impose tariffs on national security grounds, but that authority carries limits. When the underlying data is deliberately falsified, the rational foundation the law requires ceases to exist, and the tariffs become an unconstitutional exercise of executive authority built on intentional deception. The recordings implicate not only the trade staff but the cabinet directly. During a January 19th negotiating session, Canadian officials captured a phone call that took place during a break in the proceedings. 3 independent audio analysts cited in a Globe and Mail article published 2 hours ago identified the voice as belonging to the Secretary of Commerce. He is heard telling the trade representative, in language closely paraphrased from the published transcript, that the president personally reviewed and approved the final tariff figures because the inflated numbers produce better results on television. This is not an admission from a low-level official acting outside his authority. This is a cabinet secretary confirming that the president knowingly approved falsified economic grounds for a policy governing $420 billion in annual cross-border trade. Under federal criminal law, knowingly making false material statements to influence official government action is a federal felony carrying a potential sentence of up to 5 years. Every official who reviewed and signed off on that Commerce Department report now carries potential criminal liability. As the cabinet structure begins breaking apart, Reuters sources inside Treasury, speaking within 90 minutes of the recordings going public, reported that the Treasury Secretary had no prior awareness that the deficit statistics had been manipulated. He is said to have learned the truth this morning at the same time as the general public. He is described as deeply and visibly furious. At 1:15 in the afternoon Eastern Time, his office issued a brief statement saying only that the Secretary is reviewing the situation and has nothing additional to say. That choice of words describes someone in the process of weighing resignation against the alternative of continuing to publicly defend a position that can no longer be defended. The Secretary of State, who spent weeks trying to manage the diplomatic damage caused by the Canada tariffs, is reportedly telling congressional contacts that the recordings are genuine and that the White House has no credible means of challenging their authenticity. A source close to the Secretary of State told Politico that serious discussions at the cabinet level are occurring around formal objections to continuing the trade conflict. In the measured language of institutional bureaucracy, formal objections means open resistance. The timing of Canada's decision to release the recordings was not accidental. It was sequenced with precision. On the Tuesday before, the International Monetary Fund published its updated global economic forecast, cutting projected American GDP growth from 2.1% to 0.8%, and specifically naming trade policy instability, above all the Canada tariffs, as the primary obstacle to American economic performance. The IMF identified those tariffs as the single largest factor behind the anticipated contraction in American manufacturing during the second quarter. The report sent immediate shockwaves through bond markets. The 10-year Treasury yield climbed 38 basis points within 6 hours, settling at 5.14%. Mortgage rates moved above 8.6%. The Dow Jones fell 847 points. The S&P 500 shed $1.3 trillion of value in one trading session. Canada waited until financial markets had delivered their judgment on the Trump trade approach, then released documented proof that the entire policy was constructed on numbers the administration's own officials knew were false. The sequencing was deliberate and effective. Markets administered the first blow. The recordings delivered the final one. As a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, Mark Carney has an exceptionally refined understanding of how markets respond to information and when to deploy it. He released the recordings at the precise moment when American investors, retirees, and working families were already deeply angry over shrinking account balances. The recordings did not generate the public fury. They gave it a clear and specific target. Three simultaneous crises are now tearing through the executive branch. The first is the disintegration of the trade war's legal foundation. With the economic basis for the tariffs now documented as fraudulent, every pending World Trade Organization complaint filed by Canada, the European Union, Japan, and South Korea carries powerful new evidentiary support. The WTO panel was already broadly expected to rule against Washington in April. Now American officials are on audio admitting the data was engineered to order. The European Union has announced a 15% counter tariff on American agricultural products, effective April 1st. Japan is indicating potential restrictions on semiconductor component exports to American manufacturers. South Korea is reconsidering its defense cost-sharing commitments. What began as a bilateral trade dispute is becoming a widening geopolitical fracture. The second crisis is the scale of legal exposure. Congressional Democrats, together with at least 4 Republican senators from states experiencing severe economic damage, announced formation of a bipartisan investigative committee. Subpoenas covering Commerce Department internal communications, raw trade data, and the classified sections of the Section 232 report are expected to be issued by Friday. Independent federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, operating outside the Attorney General's oversight chain, are reported to have begun a preliminary review into whether transmitting fabricated trade statistics across electronic systems constitutes wire fraud. The $2,300 annual household cost, multiplied across 131 million American households, produces an aggregate harm exceeding $31 billion, which would make this the most costly alleged fraud in American history, larger than the Enron scandal. The third crisis is the real-time collapse of cabinet cohesion. White House insiders describe the internal mood as a siege. The president is reportedly furious, but not at the staff who invented the economic statistics. His anger is directed at Canada for releasing the recordings. He has pressed the Attorney General repeatedly over the past 3 hours to pursue charges against Canadian officials under the Economic Espionage Act of 1996 for recording American negotiators. Legal analysts appearing on television have already explained why such charges are constitutionally impossible, since the recordings were made lawfully on Canadian soil under Canadian law. The president appears uninterested in this legal reality. The fundamental problem facing any White House response strategy is that the 3 now silent cabinet secretaries at Treasury, State, and reportedly Defense, which is alarmed by the implications for American commitments to Japan and South Korea, form the core institutional backbone of the administration's ability to govern. Should they resign together or break into open dissent, the administration would face a legitimacy crisis more severe than anything since the Saturday Night Massacre during Watergate. That episode involved 2 resignations. This scenario involves 3. And unlike Watergate, which was centered on criminal activity and its concealment, this involves documented deception that is actively reducing the financial stability of over 130 million American households. Taking the scenario to its outermost edge, Section 4 of the 25th Amendment allows the Vice President and a majority of principal cabinet officers to declare the President unable to carry out the responsibilities of the office. That threshold has not been crossed. But the conditions that could lead there are now clearly defined. Should the President move to classify the Canadian recordings as national security material, direct the detention of journalists distributing the transcripts, dismiss dissenting cabinet members, or respond to the crisis with additional punishing tariffs that tip the economy into recession, the conversation shifts from political controversy to a genuine crisis of governmental function. history provides a sobering parallel. When Richard Nixon found himself cornered by his own White House recordings, he briefly considered having the military take physical custody of the evidence. Defense Secretary James Schlesinger quietly instructed the Joint Chiefs to disregard any irregular directives originating from the White House. That level of confrontation has not arrived yet, but the Pentagon is watching carefully. The Joint Chiefs are watching. The comparison between a trade policy revealed to rest on manufactured statistics and the Iraq weapons of mass destruction episode is difficult to set aside. One set of officials fabricated justifications for a military conflict costing trillions. Another fabricated justifications for a trade conflict that is impoverishing the American middle class. The method is identical. Only the arena has changed. The material economic damage is specific and substantial. The 25% tariff on Canadian goods has been active for 57 days. American manufacturers dependent on Canadian aluminum have absorbed cost increases averaging between $140 and $200 per ton above pre-tariff levels. The softwood lumber industry, which sources 31% of its supply from British Columbia and Ontario, has passed approximately $8,400 in additional costs per new single-family home directly onto purchasers. February housing construction starts fell 19% compared to the same period last year. The National Association of Home Builders warned last week that 340,000 construction-related jobs are at risk if the tariffs continue into the second quarter. These figures represent real losses falling on families in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, the exact states whose voters secured Trump's 2024 electoral victory, and whose economic circumstances are worsening because of a trade conflict built on numbers the administration's own personnel have now confirmed were invented. Sources inside Global Affairs Canada, cited in a Toronto Star report published 45 minutes ago, indicate that a separate collection of recordings covers energy sector discussions, specifically negotiations around a potential Keystone XL revival and proposed limits on Canadian crude exports. If those recordings reveal comparable evidence of fabricated justifications or undisclosed arrangements, energy markets will react with force. Canada delivers 3.9 million barrels of crude to the United States every day, representing 61% of total American crude imports. If the energy relationship becomes collateral damage in this rupture, gasoline prices currently averaging $4.87 nationally could exceed $6 by April. The Federal Reserve, currently holding its benchmark rate at 5.75%, while attempting to manage both inflation and recession risks simultaneously, would face a genuinely impossible set of choices, with no outcome that avoids serious economic harm. The president's political base is fracturing visibly. An Associated Press poll conducted before today's release found that 47% of Republican voters in Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska already considered the Canada tariffs damaging to their local economies. That number will climb. Soybean farmers who have lost $2.1 billion in Canadian market access are not operating from a framework of political loyalty. They are trying to keep their businesses alive. 3 prominent Republican major donors have suspended contributions to congressional campaign committees, according to a Financial Times report published at 2:30 this afternoon. Those 3 individuals alone contributed $127 million during the 2024 election cycle. That funding is gone. The recordings have been public for 4 hours. Financial destruction stands at $1.3 trillion and continues to grow. 3 cabinet secretaries are in institutional crisis. The trade war's legal foundation has crumbled. The alliance is fractured. And in Ottawa, Mark Carney is quietly observing the American system confronting the reality it refused to acknowledge since January. The tariffs were never about national security. They were about optics. The numbers were never about the deficit. They were tools for electoral advantage. The entire world can now hear those truths stated in the voices of the people who built the deception. The next 48 hours will determine whether this administration survives what has been released, or whether these recordings define this era the way the Nixon tapes defined theirs.